Hi there, everyone. Welcome to the second of this week's videos on Plato's Republic, books 6 and 7. And this is, as I mentioned, part 2. In this part, we're really going to focus on Plato's divided line, which is his theory of forms in knowledge, and this will help us flesh out further what we began to say in the last video, which is that a true philosophical education is a kind of turning of the soul, right? A turning of the soul away from mere images or appearances into the light of fundamental reality, which is the form of the good. And so what we're going to see today is that Plato's divided line is sort of like his theory of, you might say it's the interrelationship between metaphysics and epistemology, right? It's metaphysics because it's concerned with the nature of fundamental reality, but it's also epistemology because it's a theory of how we come to know that fundamental reality, what methods, what techniques are appropriate for what kind of knowledge, right? And importantly, the divided line is meant to be harmonious with the allegory for the cave, right? It's meant to clarify this notion of turning, right? One thing you might notice is if you ever look at all classical paintings of Plato, they're all pointing up, right? And that's because they're actually reflecting this moment in the Republic, right? Where the philosopher is interested in the forms of all things, right? And hence their soul, Plato says, is directed upwards, even if their body is looking downwards. Similarly, Plato says that, if what we're really interested in is sensible reality, then even if we're laying on our back, right, even if we're sleeping on our back or, floating on the shore or whatever on our backs, right? He says even if our body is pointed upwards, our soul is directed downwards, right? And so you can see that as sort of an illustration, right, from the allegory of the cave about how certain ways of acquiring knowledge, coming to think about knowledge, gain knowledge, are oriented downward in that way towards sensible particulars. And another way of orienting the soul is upwards, right? The one that Plato / the Socrates of the Republic actually suggests that we orient ourselves towards, right? And so Plato's divided line is meant to be something like a comprehensive interpretation of what kinds of knowledge are possible using what techniques and what, does this kind of knowledge range over, right? And so this is Plato's divided line, right? The first thing to notice is that it's not cut up into equal fourths, right? Why is it not cut up into equal fourths? Well, because the point that Plato's trying to say is that as you progress upwards through each stage, you have a greater and greater share of reality that is available to you, right? So, for example, the dividing line between belief and thought, it occurs relatively low down, right, in the line, right? It doesn't occur at the halfway point, and that's because there's more that we can come to understand and to think than it is that we can come to believe or imagine, right? So the distinction between the levels is noticeably unequal. That's important to Plato's account, right? And so the basic idea behind the divided line is you have roughly a 25-75 split here, right, between what we might call the realm of the visible and the realm of the intelligible, right? The realm of the visible is only 25%, the realm of the intelligible is 75%. And then similarly, within each of these realms, we have another asymmetric characterization, right? So there's less that we can imagine than we can believe. There's less that we can think than there is to understand, right? Important for Plato, right? None of these areas covered by each of these is equal, right? They all ascend in the amount that you come to know and understand, right? And generally, the idea that Plato wants to get across is that the sophist stays as low as possible in the realm of the visible. The sophist is always, in a way, pointing you, orienting you back down towards things that we only imagine, right? So, mere opinion, right? The sophist isn't interested in the truth, right? They're interested in how the truth looks to people, right? And so they try to get people that are interested in the truth back down in a certain way to their level, right? And so we can think about the realm of the visible as divided into what Plato calls the imagination, Acacia, I believe, and belief, pistis, right? And the idea is that in the realm of the imagination, you only have an image, right? Like we can come up with an image in our head, right? I can come up with an image of a caterpillar, right? And for Plato, this is about as far away from genuine knowledge as you can have. It's just being able to imagine stuff, right? Like I can imagine my favorite anime. I can imagine, a flying horse. Any of those things, right? And the sophist is always orienting you implicitly towards images and towards the imagination. Recall in the allegory of the cave, right? They're the ones manipulating the shadows, such as to produce images, right? But the point is, they don't even care about if the image that they have is correct, right? What they care about is simply having an image. I accidentally erased some of this. There we go. Jeez, that's ugly. Oh god, it's getting worse. Okay, let's rewrite it. And so the imagination, Acacia, provides you only with an image. But belief is like you getting back to the original, right? So like maybe you have an image, say, of your favorite book, right? And then you have genuine beliefs about that image once you've encountered the actual book itself, right? And so this is sort of like direct sense experience, right? This is maybe just the ability to represent it, the ability to have an image of it or something like that. And this is encountering the thing itself, the sensible particular, right? And this is where the realm of the visible ends, right? Because the closest thing that you can do to something in the visible world is to encounter it directly, right? Imagination is maybe an indirect way of encountering particulars, right? And belief is a direct way of encountering the particular, right? So instead, you go from the image to the original thing, right? But here we're still talking about empirical particular things, right? Like I can go to my favorite book and touch it and feel it and get an image, get a mental representation of it, right? But then there's a leap that you can do, a leap into a totally different kind of realm. It requires a totally different way of reasoning. And this is how Plato thinks that you enter the realm of the intelligible, right? So the first example that he has is what he calls thought, dianoia, right? And what he has here is like math and geometry, right? And math and geometry are very, very important for Plato. This is something that we've talked about kind of over and over, right, to this point. But, math in an important way points you beyond the existent physical world, right? So 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's true even if there aren't 4 things in the universe, right? It's an eternal, it's a rational truth. It's a truth about the nature of number, right? And so Plato's way of thinking about this kind of knowledge is that this kind of knowledge works through what we might call, we'll just put this up here, we'll put hypothesis plus inference, right? So in mathematical reasoning, you're like, okay, well, let me hypothesize there are these things, numbers, right? And if you take that idea seriously, then here's everything that follows from that, right? Another way of putting this, right, is that mathematical truths are conditional truths, right? If there's 2 and you add 2, then it's 4, right? So there's a condition. If there's 2 and you add 2 and then you get the result, right, then it's 4, right? And so in a way, these are all conditionals. These are all if statements, right? If there's such thing as a figure, if there's such thing as a plane, if there's such thing as a triangle, then the interior angles of the triangle add up to 2 right angles, right? This is, some way that you can get from a hypothesis about the nature of figures in space and geometric objects to certain kinds of truths. Important, right? It's important that when we engage in math, when we engage in geometry, right, we are not making direct contacts with like the original triangle or something like that, right? We're assuming we can apply a kind of mathematical reasoning to the existent physical world and proceeding on the basis of that hypothesis to see what inferences, what conclusions from that we can reasonably draw. And so when you think this way, you can discover a great share about reality. But still, the highest form of knowing, the form of knowing that goes even beyond thought, even beyond dianomia, is what Plato calls understanding, or noesis, right? I've written insight here, right? And so the idea here is this, right? When we were in the stage of thought, we needed this hypothesis, right? We said, if this is true, then this is true, right? And so we needed a kind of hypothesis in order for us to assume and then make our inferences from, right? What Plato has in mind with dialectic is something where you don't actually need to assume anything, right? And so what does Plato have in mind? Well, he has in mind exactly a Socratic dialogue, right? What happens in a Socratic dialogue? Well, we put something forward as a hypothesis, namely about the nature of justice or number or virtue or whatever, right? And then dialectic is the process of testing that hypothesis through forms of rational questioning, right? One reservation that you might have about this kind of knowledge and about, the process of dialectic in general is you might wonder, does it go anywhere? Right? I mean, one of the problems that we had in Socratic dialogues, at least so it seems, right, is that we didn't arrive at any conclusions. Right? For however much, we went through the process of asserting a hypothesis and testing it and so on, Socrates didn't arrive at the end of that with, like, the answer, right? That's not how the dialogues that we've read together have ended, right? And Plato's answer to this concern is to say, well, of course, we're skeptical about dialectic, right? We're skeptical about dialectic exactly because the sophists practice dialectic, but in a perverted way, right? The sophist gives us the primary example of the thing that we're so afraid of in Plato's account, right? Namely, that it's this discussion that doesn't go anywhere, right? It's not productive of anything. And so the fact that, the worry that we have that we're just in dialectic going to keep going around in circles and not be able to prove the initial points that we wanted to prove, right? Plato says that happens because we've lived in unphilosophical societies, unphilosophical civilizations. But if you do dialectic like I, Plato, do dialectic, right, then you arrive at a genuine understanding of the nature of fundamental reality. That thing that came in initially as a hypothesis, you get to, in a way, like confirm its essential nature, and therefore discover the highest truths, right? Very, very ambitious claim. And of course, it's very funny for him to put, his own method, really the one that he invented, the one that's essential to the dialogue form, as, the highest method for philosophy, right? One way to think about the divided line that I think is very productive is to think about Plato as being kind of a hybrid between Parmenides and Heraclitus, right? This brings us back to philosophers that we discussed really at the beginning of the semester, right? And the way I put it here is that Plato is a Parmenidean about the forms, but a Heraclitean about material nature, right? So what makes this the realm of the visible and this the realm of the intelligible? Well, the forms are what they are, right? Plato will often say they're themselves by themselves, right? Missing nothing, changing nothing. And so are true objects of knowledge, right? And remember, Parmenides said that we couldn't have knowledge of particular things because they change, right? And that would require us to say that nothing exists or that nothing is real, right? The forms are, in a way, Plato's way of trying to meet this Parmenidean challenge, right? Of providing something stable and unchanging that can be, that we can say really foundational, rational, universal truths about, right? Like the forms do not exist in time. The forms do not depend on the particulars that participate in them, and so on, right? And it's because they're unchanging that we can say that they are true objects of knowledge, right? By contrast, particulars undergo changes and become what they are not, which prevents true knowledge of them, right? So, the best case for like maybe physical kind of knowledge, right? I see a candle, I see that it's lit, right? I say the candle is lit, right? Or something like that. But then time passes, a breeze rolls by, the candle gets blown out, right? Now, the judgment that I said before that was true is now false, right? And so it's precisely because particulars undergo changes that they are this lower realm of reality, right? And it's why we don't have, understanding or thought of them. We only have imagination and belief, right? We hope things will continue to stay the same, right? We can make a predictive hypothesis up to this point that they've stayed the same. But we can't say with a certainty that they will, right? By contrast, the forms we can always say are eternal or missing nothing, they have no parts. And as a result, it seems like when I learned the form of goodness, for example, I learned about the nature of all good things. But if I try to learn about the nature of goodness using my imagination, for example, well, then I'm likely to think about like particular things, right? Like, do I think parenthood, motherhood, for example, is good or bad, right? And the truth is, sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad, right? So it doesn't really make sense to have judgment like, is motherhood good or bad in general, right? We don't really have knowledge of the visible world like that. But by contrast, I can always say the form of justice is good. I can always say, that the form of beauty is beautiful. The form of beauty is more beautiful than any of the particulars that participate in beauty, and so on, right? And it's precisely the stability of these judgments that proves their superiority to these judgments, right? The realm of the visible is constantly changing. Truths about them, therefore, also constantly change. whereas the intelligible is always the same, and consequently truths about the intelligible also are always the same. It's worth noting that Plato goes pretty far in this, right? He gets to the point where he actually says that knowledge of sensible things is impossible, right? Here's a good quote that I think is really interesting and brings it back to the point we were making before about turning, right? That the philosopher seeks to turn you away from the realm of the visible to the realm of the intelligible. At one point, Socrates says, if anyone attempts to learn anything about sensible things, whether by gaping upwards or squinting downwards, I'd claim, since there is no knowledge of such things, that he never learns anything, and that even if he studies laying on his back on the ground or floating on it in the sea, his soul is not looking up, but down. Okay, I hope that you found this really interesting, perhaps provocative. Do you agree with Plato that there are no truths about the sensible physical world? Or do you think that he's gone too far? Is this, a plausible conception of how we can think about knowledge or not? I very much look forward to what you have to say. We're going to have to cut it here, even though the Republic is very rich and there's a lot more that we could talk about. I look forward to your thoughts and your contributions. Have a great week. Bye.